Hey homies, what's up? Ryan Wynn here with another episode of Late Night Inks. But before we get started, I'd like to announce that we hit 600 subs. And later this week, I was going to announce the email list for Hammerella on Indiegogo. And to sort of celebrate both, I want to give you guys a sneak peek of some of the animation I've been working on for that. Some of you have seen bits and pieces of this, but I don't think anyone's heard the music. But again, this is rough, so here we go. Alright, well, enough about that. You're not here for that. You're here for Late Night Inks.
Give us any chance, we'll take it. Read us any rules, we'll break it. We're gonna make our dreams come true. Doing it our way.
Alright, good evening, everyone. Hope you're all doing well, staying healthy. Don't forget, Gods and Gears 4 is out. I have some in the shop. They will be signed. I only have a few of issue 1 left. If you want to get those, well, you can. Otherwise, I'm only going to have a few in sets and collections in the coming weeks ahead until we get those second prints later this summer. All right, let's put that aside. Let's introduce our guest tonight. He is the, not the original Daredevil. He's the second Daredevil in comics, but he's the most popular one, and he's the one you probably know the most. This is Marvel Comics Daredevil. This is slightly inspired by John Romita's take on him. I'm not doing an after Romita because this wasn't swiped like I did the Peter Parker piece. This is just sort of taking what he did with the figure and the shapes and things like that. So, you probably already guessed, we're using Stinger tonight. My Raphael 8404 size 2 brush. We are also using this Black India ink Ultra Draw. I put it into a ink jar. I have my own empty ink jars. You can get them for a couple bucks. It's super cheap. Or if you use up a bottle of ink that you like, you can wash that out and put your own ink in it. So we dip the brush about halfway to 2/3. And we're going to start with the contours. So we're going to leave the brush pretty wet with ink. We want to get a nice heavy line. I do a little flick on the inside of the jar, and then I have a little board next to it that I do maybe 1 or 2 wipes or swipes to get a little of that extra moisture, make sure there's not too much water. So we're going to identify our figure, and that's what I call doing the contour lines. So when I'm inking comic books or an illustration or anything like that, if there are multiple elements in the room, say there's a person and an automobile, I would like to outline them first, and in my own vocabulary, I call that identifying the objects. And that sort of brings my design aspect of comic work, where I see things as shapes and compositions, big chunks of shapes. All right, we're going to give some nice healthy lines here. Now, Daredevil's always been one of my favorite comic book characters. As a kid, I had just missed the Frank Miller stuff while I was going to the shop weekly. I started while Ann Nocenti and John Romita Jr. were on board. And then shortly after, I jumped back and read a bunch of the Frank Miller stuff. So I was pretty young when I read that stuff. Probably started at 10 or 11. Ann Nocenti was always one of my favorite writers. And what she did with Daredevil was pretty freaking cool. If you like the character, if you like the show, I highly recommend going back and reading the Frank Miller stuff, where Frank does the writing and the art, and then he also does a run where David Musicelli, who is the artist of fame on Batman Year One, they did a run together called Born Again. That is a definitive piece in Daredevil lore. All right, we are cruising through this. I'm thinking we can get all these contours done with the one brush dip. And then, let's see. So Frank Miller and David Musicelli did Born Again. And that was a deconstruction of Daredevil, and it broke it down and built him back up and introduced a lot of the sort of issues that he has now that everyone still plays around with in their stories and their versions of Daredevil. And then Ann Nocenti had to come in and start. I think she started with him being a fry cook. That's where Frank Miller left him. All right, so jumping back to the art here, we are hitting the eyes now. A lot of the times, you guys know, you're like, wait, you do the eyes first. But I usually do the eyes first if I've got to do pupils and things like that. If they're these big old empty blind guy eyes, these big old blank eyes, I'm not that worried about them going first. All right, we're going to go nice and heavy on those. It's not only because these shapes are going to be black around it, but this is the underside of his eyebrow, his brow area. And again, go nice and heavy there. And remember to line up your shots. That's what I call this. I do it very quickly. It will become second nature. So that's just planning where your shots, your line's going to go. I call it a shot. I have said before, I equate a lot of things to sports, a lot of my art analogies. Like throwing a line, things like that. All right, now I've kind of inked myself into a corner. These lines are still a little wet. These are still a little wet. These are still a little wet. So we've got to watch where we go next. I can make this connection. I can spin around and do the same here. Biggity bam. Let's see. That's there. We are good to go here. All right, gonna go ahead and give ourselves like a heavy chisel line here, 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 and here. And then one here for the underside of the nose. Then we've got those heavy black shapes. We'll come back because I still got wet lines there. We're sort of working as a printer now. I'm going to be working down the excuse me, I'm going to be working down the center of the page. Beef up that line a little bit. And then we're going to hit these collarbones, and these are going to be the cutoff points for the image. It's going to be black down to there, and where the collarbones dip in and meet, that will be the cutoff for the image. All right, we're not doing bad. Getting through this pretty quick. So some of the fun in the Daredevil run, getting back to that, was, so Ann Nocenti started, and it was very street level. He's a fry cook. He's got to get back into the swing of things. And then partway through their run, they had a crossover with the X-Men for their Inferno storyline. And I loved that. I thought what she did, she made New York seem like the scariest place on Earth, like scarier than hell or Limbo or any of the crazy cosmic planets in Marvel. And she did such a good job with how Daredevil would handle all of this stuff, where he was going from street level stuff to now he's dealing with mutants and demons from Limbo. And John Romita and Al Williamson did a phenomenal job. Al Williamson's an old school illustrator and inker. He did a lot of awesome work at Marvel. A lot of his best stuff was, a lot of my favorite stuff of his, maybe not his best, but some of my favorite stuff of his was his Star Wars work that he did in the 80s, early 80s. And his inks over, if you see his inks over Romita, and you look at what, sorry I said that weird, you look at what David Finch does with his inks, you can see a lot of inspiration in how Al Williamson handled John Romita's pencils. All right, if you are not an inker or you're new to inking, you may be wondering what all these little X's are. And this is sort of a shorthand for pencilers to give to inkers for fill this area in with solid black. You'll outline anywhere that you want white. You don't mark anything in those areas, you just leave that blank. And then anywhere you want black, you mark an X. Now, in the 20 years I've been doing this, and all the people I assisted, I never asked what the X why the X. It was just, that's what it was. And you do BWS for black with stars. You're dealing with space. And that way the penciler can save time for shading in and stuff like that, because sometimes your deadlines are so hectic that even just to shade in an area is a waste of time when you can just make X's. So part of me, though, thinks that it comes from CMYK, and the K being for black, I think this used to be a K. That's what my guess is, and that the X just, it became a quicker form of that. I'm sure I can do a little research on the interweb and find out pretty quickly. Probably even ask some old school, or some guys that know about old school comic booking on the Twitter and stuff like that, but that's my personal theory right now. All right, so we have this core shadow on the figure, and classic Marvel artists are great at this. You'll look at from your Gene Colans to your Mark Silvestris, your John Romitas, and even your Greg Capullos and Todd McFarlane's. There, you'll have your shape, your figure, and then you'll have this the black shadow. Usually, depending on the color, they don't use much black. We're putting Daredevil into shadow here, but if it was a blue character, they often use black. Like you'll notice the blue on Spider-Man on some of the classic images. So they have this coarse shadow, and that sort of gives definition and dimension to the shape and the figure. All right, we're almost ready to go in and do these fine details. That's what I'm excited about. I save the stuff I like to do for the end. So while that stuff dries, I'll explain a little here that is a cool design element. So he has these horns popping up out of this black shape, and you could have this shadow down here, you could put the horns anywhere else, but if you have them kind of like 1/3 in and sticking out 2/3, it sort of creates an attractive element for the eye, and it creates dimension there, like that. Having that white pop out, and then adding a little bit of gray with the rendering gives even more dimension to it. So we'll black over this now. There you go. That's your lesson. Okay, let's go in and do this nose area now. Now I'm doing thinner lines, so I'm holding the brush more upright so that I get a finer line. And I have one loose hair, but it doesn't seem to be touching the board, so I'm going to leave it be now. I don't know if you can see that in the video. Now sometimes I'll do thin lines that are next to each other, and sometimes I'll just do thin lines to build up a big black shape. You know, sometimes I'm bold and I do it in one stroke, but sometimes I said sometimes like 20 times in there. Often I will build up the line on delicate areas like the nose or the eyes, if I don't want to risk going too heavy on a line right away. All right, there we go. We'll finish up the nose there. Now, as far as modern Daredevil, the Bendis run was okay. I thought it was actually pretty boring. Some of the art was great, but it was pretty boring, and the stuff that followed was boring because I had to deal with that. And I sort of bounced after that. But I read Daredevil. He was one of the books I read, no matter who the creator was. From the time I was 10 to the time I was like, I don't know, 30 something. All right, I'm blowing on this ink here because I want that to be dry. I do the gray on the sides of the nose because the nose is protruding out, and again, I'm always trying to add dimension, and so that adds like a shaded tone to the side of the nose because it's the most protruding thing on the face. Okay, that's dry now. We can go in and do this rendering here underneath the lips. And have it come out like that. You can build up to black if you want in there. It doesn't have to just stay rendering. You can get really heavy with the lines if you want. And you don't even have to do this chin line if you don't want to. It's not a necessary thing. I'd actually be kind of curious to see how many of you have different takes on this. All right, we're wetting the brush again. We're going to come in and do a little test here, see how wet the brush is. All right, I'm going to go really heavy and see how I'm almost laying the brush down. We're going to come in and do these fat bleeds like that under his chin. And it's okay to go across the line like that because this will all be in shadow. We're going to break out our heavy brush in a minute and do that. All right, and lastly, we're going to go in and you can do these however you want. My lines are just suggestions. And recommendations. And it is awesome seeing other people's takes on my pencils. I forgot to mention that at the beginning of the show, that there is a link down below that you can download this image to ink along. Whether you're an artist or not, feel free to give it a shot. We're here just to have fun and talk about comic stuff and talk about the process of inking. So even if you're not an artist, some of this stuff is kind of fun to try. Inking's a fun, relaxing, craft. And you don't have to worry about all the thoughts of drawing or anything like that. You just gotta make some lines. All right, I like to use a nice big heavy brush. And I don't like to go in and scribble. I like to everything go in one direction. And usually I like to follow the form. Sometimes I break up these lines so that there's a little bit of white in between so you can see the brush strokes and it helps to build the forms. But with these sort of classic takes on the characters, I really like to go solid black. I think it helps them pop more than when I get lost in having fun with lines, which is one of the things we'll talk about in future episodes is getting lost in the inking. Excuse me. Because you can have fun doing shading or textures or something like that, and it's not always the thing that's needed. All right, we got that filled in. We've only got to do the core shadow on the cheeks and the forehead now. And this was a job that assistants, when I started working as an assistant for, say, Danny Mickey or John Livesay or Joe Weems, you did what was called spotting the blacks, which was a little bit different than the original term. The original term meant that the inker actually picked the areas and filled in black. They decided where the shadows were. And then it just became a term for filling in the black areas completely. So you would be in charge of, or not, I guess not in charge, someone else is in charge of you, but you would be tasked with filling in all these areas with black. And you can't go over the lines that the ink master has put down as the apprentice, otherwise you got to white out, and you want to white out as little as possible. Different studios have different takes on that, but just even for building your own confidence and making the proper strokes and movements to begin with, you don't want to always rely on your whiteout. And if you're working digitally, you don't want to rely on your jump back or your Control Z. Now here, I want to cover as much territory with as little movement. You don't want to be scribbling in with a little marker to fill in these giant black areas. You see that sometimes they scribble in with a marker and do all these and I always looked at it like, I don't know, my hand can only do so many brush strokes or movements per day. I want to get the most out of it. But some people find that meditative, so that's okay too. All right, we went out of bounds there. If I was an assistant, I'd get my wrist slapped. And your job as an assistant was also to make sure it was solid black, so that when the either the studio head or boss or ink master, whatever, went to erase it, or if the other assistant was erasing it, they didn't have to cover up any spots where the ink lifts. All right, there we go. Let's see, we are going to have to sign this bad boy. Oh, almost lost it. And sign it with a zebra brush marker. There's links for the brushes down below if you want to try out those same brushes. And if you do the ink along, make sure you sign it right here, and either hit me up below or hit me up on Twitter at Ryan Wynn. And I'd love to share your work here. And future, I don't know what we're going to do on the next episode. I do like doing the episodes once a week. That seems to be working out better, especially since it's turned into a sort of ink along. I'd also like to do some erasing and coloring of this later this week. Maybe I can post a video of that. So, until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and take it easy. And if you haven't already, head over to alternateaccess.com and check out the book I wrote, Gods and Gears, with art by Dean Kotz and letters by Wes Loker. Issue 4 is out soon.
Stupid cat.